You've just landed Inside LaunchStreet, the innovation podcast, where we interview top innovators out there shaking things up so you can innovate and differentiate and get further, faster in this crazy, cluttered world. And now, innovation thought leader and your super fly host, Tamara Kleinberg.
Hey, LaunchStreet, Tamara here, your guide and lover of scented markers. They're like corporate brainstorm crack. Actually, watermelon is my favorite. And what made me think of that? Well, what made me think of that is today on LaunchStreet, we have a pretty incredible interview for you that I'm excited about. It is the Chief Talent Officer at General Motors, Michael Arena. And part of the reason I wanted to have him on is he's doing some disruptive things, but also because I know a lot of you struggle with the balance between wanting to be innovative and disrupt and do things differently and being in a system team organization where you have to have structure and processes and maybe where that really guides a lot of things. I think in a bigger company in particular, you need those processes and those systems to keep everybody moving forward on the same ship. But at the same time, you want to be able to, steer in different directions and find those gaps for innovation. And he's done an incredible job of that. And he's going to share some really, I think, some interesting insights and ways that they're doing that in General Motors and the way that he's doing it as well. There's a lot of innovation happening in this large company. All right, here we go. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Tamara. I am as well.
So, what's that one thing people would be surprised to learn about you?
the dreaded question, isn't it?
It's the couch question.
So here I am. I work in this giant organization, General Motors, and we make cars and trucks. And surprisingly, my garage is not full of cars or trucks, but motorcycles. So ever since I was a little kid, one of my passions has been racing, riding, and it's my therapy these days. So, whenever I am frustrated, whenever I need new perspective, I am known for hopping on a motorcycle and driving west. So that is my vice, I guess.
I have to ask, because I am petrified of motorcycles. How did you get into it? And when you say you have a garage full, are you talking one or like 20? What does that mean?
It depends on how you count parts. But I've got 4 working motorcycles right now and a handful that are being rebuilt that at some point in time in my life, when I have a moment, I may actually get to them.
Well, how fun.
And just to answer the first question, I rode a motorcycle before I rode a bicycle. So I think it's
just in your blood.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's back up for a second so people understand your perspective. You are Chief Talent Officer at General Motors, as you said, very large company. What is your vision for talent at General Motors? What are you trying to accomplish in that role?
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty traditional answer, and that we, like every other company on planet Earth, need to get the best people possible into the organization. We need to leverage and get the most out of people who are here. So it's things like talent acquisition, it's things like building a robust talent pipeline, and it's things like making sure that people are fully engaged so that they truly are leveraging all of their potential. I think that's the typical answer. If I were to add to that and say what's unique here, we do a lot of work, and this is very different than what I've seen in other organizations around social capital. So it's one thing to say I want to hire the best and brightest, but if we cannot get them positioned into the appropriate place inside the organization, we're not able to leverage that talent. We're not able to leverage their experiences and their skills. So we do a lot of network mapping. We think a lot about networks and informal relationships. And a major part of my focus is thinking about how do I get people positioned for greater success?
So I have so many questions for you. So I'm going to back up for a second. And the first question I have is when you say the best people, attracting them and also retaining them and, engaging them, what do you mean by best? And part of the reason I'm asking is, there's all this conversation out there right now about like, how do we get people to think differently? How do we get them to be more innovative? We've got these skills that we need, but then we've also got this critical thinking that we need. So when you think of best, because to me, it's one of those words that we all say but mean differently, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, and I'm glad you picked up on that because I I hate whenever HR people say, here's our approach and here's our competency model. This is what we look for in great employees. The reality is it depends, and it depends a great deal. And this is where the innovation stuff really comes to life, if you will, in large complex organizations. In some cases, if I'm talking about the growth part of the organization, I want people, I want the cutting edge skills that we all talk about. I want people that understand, AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. I want people who, are mathematicians and are really, developing the next breakthrough algorithm. In other cases, if I'm asking somebody to manage the core, I want a general manager. I want the person who can scale, who can manage a big complex operation. So the answer of what's best is highly, highly specific to the actual intention of a given business group and or function.
How do you know if someone is in the right role? Aside from the obvious, they're doing their job, right? They're hitting their goals. Are there other more subjective things that you look for to say that's the right fit right there? Kind of to your point about the network mapping and where people go.
Well, the network tells you a lot, which is why I love this whole concept of social capital. The answer is, if we use our traditional conventional methods for evaluating talent, people know how to game the system. They know how to play a 360. They know how to, connect. Seriously.
Yeah.
And they know who to be in with and who not to. And they can play games. But if you actually look at the network, it's a little bit of like what we know about social networks these days. It's self-regulating. And if you're really, really good at managing up and terrible at managing across or managing down, your network will tell you that. And the people that you interact with will make that known, and you'll be pushed to the edge. And so we can tell a lot about where a person's positioned on the network.
So tell me a little bit about social capital. I mean, I think I get it, right? You're really talking about it's not just a hierarchy of who's above you and below you, but how it all fits together. How do you? I mean, I have this beautiful visual in my head right now, and it's almost organic and moving. How do you think of it, and how do you manage that?
Yeah. I think it is organic and moving. That's one of the things that makes it so complex. The simple definition of social capital is, who have you established trust with? Who are your go-to people, and who are the people that you built equity up in those relationships, right? So that's the academic answer. The real answer is, and I can do this best by giving you an example, right? You can hire really smart people, and this has happened, right? Where we go out, we look at, the person that went to the best schools, the person that has a breakthrough experience, maybe even a person who started their own business. And we look at them and say, wow, this person's really smart. And then we bring them into an organization and they get rejected. They get pushed to the fringe. And we all know these people. These are the people that have to be sometimes all the time, the smartest person in the room. And eventually what they know gets marginalized. They get pushed to the edge, and, you get the glazed facial look over.
Nobody cares what they actually know.
People stop listening. And, that's a wasted asset. So that's like a real live living example of social capital. I would rather have somebody who's and this is always contextual, but I would rather have somebody who's in the center of that network, who knows a little bit less, but can get what they know leveraged and seeded into the network for greater impact.
What do you think? I've been so fascinated by what you just said with this whole, you'd rather have someone in the center of that network. And I think LaunchStreeters out there listening, think about how you live your day at work and kind of how you interact with others. What do you think makes someone good at that?
So Rob Cross is a researcher who's done a ton of work on organizational networks, the last 2 decades worth of work. And what he says through, looking at hundreds of different companies, so I'll leverage his research to answer the question. What he says is that, when you step into a large, complex, strong cultured organization, it takes about 3 years to be assimilated in. Now, that number was stunning to me.
Yeah.
It's like, I want people producing 3 months in, but it takes about 3 years. But then he went out and studied what he calls fast movers. And fast movers are people that actually move from the edge to the center of the network, in as little as a third of that time. And they went out and looked at the traits of a fast mover. And the fast mover, is net a giver. If you want to borrow Adam Grant's work, net they're a giver. They're helping other people. It's not about them. It's about the team and the organization. They're helping other people be better at what they do, and they're really thinking more holistically than getting themselves known.
So LaunchStreeters out there, I just want you to take a pause because what Michael is talking about is so important. And the question I want you all to ask yourself is, are you in the center or on the edge of your own network? Because I bet you for some of us, that's going to be a revelation that maybe we like or maybe we don't like. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the things you've written in the LinkedIn articles, which is why we reached out to you. One of them you talked about, I think it's today organizations need to embrace the mantra, quotes, positively disrupt or be disrupted. I loved that. Will you talk more about that?
Yeah. And I want to come back to a comment that you made just a moment ago and make sure I clarify something at some point. And that is, there is actually a time where being on the fringe of the network is exactly what you want. And I'll come around to that in answering this question. We live in the era of disruption, right? The world is moving fast. And, most of our organizations have grown up in a different era. Most of our large organizations in particular have grown up in a different era. And it was about plug in the standard practices, plug in the formal operating practices. But in the era of disruption, it's all about speed, swiftness, and agility. And these very structures that made us successful in the past have created inertia that lock us into, a predated or, outdated, I should say, framework. So, I think that every organization is poised for disruption. So I think take that away as a premise for a moment, and then ask yourself the question, would you rather be disrupted or be the disruptor? And, so that's what I mean by positive disruption. You will be disrupted. It may take longer in highly regulated environments. I mean, you take education, you take government, those are institutions that will take a long time to be disruptive because they've fortified themselves on the fringes. But most organizations don't have those luxuries, and eventually the disruptors are going to be chipping away and then surprise, you're disrupted.
Right.
So why not positively disrupt yourself first?
I'm so glad you said the surprised word, by the way, because when I do keynote speaking on innovation, that's one of the things that I talk about and believe very strongly in is that, when you're not the one disrupting, it takes you by surprise. And it's always interesting because it happens in all these little nuggets. And then all of a sudden, one day you walk in and your market share has decreased or the customer has shifted or, fill in the blank. And it's always so surprising, isn't it, when you're on the inside looking out going, wait, what just happened?
So I'm actually going to use that as an opportunity to go back to the thing that I wanted to describe, because yes, absolutely. And that's why sometimes you want people on the fringe of the network. And here's why. If you're only measuring an internal network, some of those people that are on the fringe are the ones that are actually connected externally. They're the ones that are creating the brokerage ties outside. And what they do, and this is the anecdote to being surprised, is they're scouting. They're paying attention to what's happening in the outside world. And what they're doing is discovering. And they're paying, considerable attention, not to what you are doing and how you show up with your product lines or services today, but to the future. And they're monitoring, and they are, sort of the canaries in the coal mine, paying attention to what's happening outside and bringing it back in so that others can, pay attention and listen to them.
So what have you found? I'm so glad you brought that up because that's a very different way. I was thinking of the fringe as people who are just not in tune and not connected, but you're saying they're kind of that. The connection then is what goes to the outside world, so to speak, versus the inside.
Could be. There are some people that are on the fringe that simply have just been marginalized. And every network, I don't want to get too technical, but every network is in the context. So when I'm looking at the context of this function inside General Motors, and I see people on the fringe, I then ask the second question. So they're not connected to this network, but are they connected to another network? And if they are, then I say, great, that's exactly where I want them. If they're not, then they may have just been marginalized and simply, we have another issue.
It's very Office Space. So take your swing line stapler and go from office to office, just to date myself a little bit. So here's what I'd love to understand, because I know that we have innovators out there in our community who I would say are on the fringe, given what you just said, how you defined it, the ones who are, maybe they are connected internally, but more importantly, they're also really in tune externally and paying attention. How do we leverage those people? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but I find that sometimes those people accidentally get marginalized because people don't know how to use them.
Yeah, it is, oftentimes what I see is the innovators are the ones screaming most loud inside of organizations about, the bureaucracy and the structure and all these things that are squelching out their brilliant idea. And, it's just stifling them. It's inhibiting them. But there's actually been a lot of work done on this topic in regards to, I can talk about external bridges, but you better have some internal bridges as well.
Yeah.
So if you can't get that information pulled back into the organization, and you don't always have to be the one to do that, you may have one partner. But there was a great study that was done. It was an academic study where it actually looked at external innovation scouts, and a particular organization was investing heavily in it. And what they found out was, yes, you get great discoveries that way, but it was actually the people that also had very rich internal connections that were the greatest innovators. So they more is not better, but they always focus on the right relationships.
Have you seen it's a 3-minute TED Talk video from Derek Sivers? I don't know that I'm saying his name right. It's about the first follower, that is not the crazy leader. Have you seen this?
I absolutely have.
Yeah, it kind of what you're saying reminds me of that a little bit of, like, you need the champion.
Yeah, exactly. And we've spun that a little inside, and we use that video all the time, but I call it the first friend.
Yeah, it's great.
And whenever I'm thinking about innovators, the first thing an innovator wants to do inside of a large, complex organization, the very first thing they want to do is they want to go to the top of the organization and say, look at what I've created and give me all the credit, and isn't this awesome? It's the dumbest move you can make.
Tell me more.
I don't have a better way of saying it other than saying that is the easiest way to be uninvited from the game at that point in time. You're much better off to start seeding your network, and you're much better off to go find a friend. The first friend matters most. They have credibility in the system because you're advocating for your thing. If they start to advocate, they're advocating for your thing. So people listen. They're more objective. And then if you can get that to sort of buzz up across the network, and we call these people energizers, what ultimately happens is you get invited into the leadership team, but it's a whole different disposition because somebody's already heard about your thing, and you're being invited in to make a pitch based on interest at that point, as opposed to you trying to push it through the brick wall.
That is such great advice. And what you're saying is just reminding me why we have LaunchStreet On Demand, which is an online innovation course. It's micro-learning, all these different innovation tools. And the ones that get watched the most over and over again are the ones about how do you communicate your ideas, not necessarily the ones about how to create your ideas, although both are important. But what I hear you saying is, hey, let's not let the ego drive it. Let's build those networks and get the momentum going behind what you're trying to accomplish.
And I am so glad you mentioned the word ego, because that is a core element of this whole thing. So we actually learned this by mistake, which is always the best discoveries. And we were actually doing academic research, and that's how I started down this path of even some of the writing, is that we were interested in a very simple question. And academics, I was just part of the group, actually went into large, complex organizations and asked the simple question: why is it that some ideas garner organizational momentum and attention and manifest into innovations?
Great question.
And yet equally fit. This is the more important part of this from a discovery standpoint. Equally fit ideas, like ideas that people liked as much, don't.
Yeah.
And this was what we found. It was an amazing discovery for us. And that is, every time we went for a successful idea, they would always tell us, you need to go talk to Tamara.
Yeah.
You need to go talk to Julie. You need to go talk to Jim. And every time we would go talk to another person, they would give us more names.
Oh.
But every time we found more names, we would then ask this question: tell us about an idea you'd liked as much as this one, but it never got liftoff. And they would give us a name. And this was the astonishment for us, is when we went and talked to those people, they would literally go into a fit of rage against the system. If people would have only listened to me, and only it wasn't for this bureaucracy, and what we found was, they never gave us other names. So it really became phenomenal for us to think that this is, Yeah, this is a social phenomenon inside large complex organizations. And if you're willing to let go of some of your idea so others can jump on and grab a hold of it, it will take off. If you grab and hold tight to it and want all the credit, it will suffer an early demise.
What a fascinating finding. And, Michael, I think I'm going to add to kind of why I think what you're saying is so important. And that is that I find that those people, those second group of people you talked about who then start to rail against the system tend to have this, they don't get it. They didn't see my brilliance. This they group is always a problem. Mm-hmm. And my argument to those people, because I've done a lot, with new product development and with innovation, creating cultures of innovation, there's always those people. I always come across them. And my, gentle argument, or maybe not so gentle at times, back to them is always, they don't have the problem, you do. And I'm not sure I ever quite could clarify why, but now with what you're saying, it totally makes sense. And I think when that group takes on the they versus themselves mentality, it's no wonder, right? It's somebody else's problem.
Well, and then let's face it, like most of us hate bureaucracy, most of us hate standard procedures, especially anyone who's innovative and entrepreneurial. But the reality is, it's your best friend if it's actually supporting your idea. It's the easiest way to build scale.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is an advantage to large corporations as opposed to startups is they're scalable machines. If you can figure out how to create these on-ramps, you can get your idea scaled radically far more quickly than if you're trying to start this thing up on your own.
That's really interesting. So we talk a little bit about that because I think the myth out there, given what you're saying, is that, you have to be a startup to scale fast or to do things entrepreneurially. And what I hear you saying is actually that system can push you forward.
I think, and this is all about, we've got to disrupt conventional, organizational models and frameworks. Yeah. And we've got to stop thinking about the one size fits all, because if that is our mindset, then it is almost impossible to innovate inside large, complex organizations. But if you start to think about it differently, and you start to think about it from a social capital standpoint, what you realize is you can, if you're very deliberate in setting different types of connections at different points in time, you can actually scale faster. And I'll give you the best example in this. I try to use real cases as much as I can. I studied an organization, I can't mention its name, but a small entrepreneurial mid-sized company that have been incredibly successful in their space, but it was a very narrow product niche, was acquired by a very large bureaucratic organization. The smaller organization, it felt like a marriage, as a disaster early on. And the smaller company, like many, said, this is ridiculous. This isn't what we were promised. This isn't what we thought we were getting. But the larger company fought against it. But after the smaller company and the people, more importantly, within it, started to bridge and build relationships into the larger entity, they were able to take the concept that was core to the one product line and scale it across 7 or 8 product lines into this large marketing engine. And they got scaled 10 times faster than they would have ever gotten had they remained themselves.
Right, because you don't have the resources or the bandwidth or distribution or any of those other elements.
Exactly.
So I want to go back to what you said about, yes, you can be faster and scale quickly, but you have to disrupt traditional models. I want to talk about both sides of the coin. So one side is, what mistakes do you think large companies are making and trying to be innovative or trying to disrupt, or why they're not, I suppose? And then there's the flip side to that, right? Which is, why do you think companies like General Motors and others, what are you guys doing to make sure you're doing the disrupting?
I'm going to start with the second part and then go back to the first part in a moment. When I think about how do you innovate inside of these large, complex entities, there is a disadvantage, and we all know it, right? The disadvantage is you've got current customers, you've got current expectations, you've got to deliver to the street, you've got to deliver to the customers, and you've got to make money.
Well, you've got billion-dollar ships, right? Like, these are huge, massive ships.
Exactly. So, and it's got to be reliable, it's got to be precise, and you're delivering something at scale. So you actually do have to be an operational engine. I think the way you do it is to start to think bimodal. And when I think of it this way, and some call this ambidexterity, and Charles O'Reilly, who's someone we partnered with quite a bit on at Stanford, has spent a lot of time talking about ambidexterity, if you will. But this whole bimodal concept is how you position your growth bets as opposed to how you position your core of your organization is probably the most critical question that organizations have to ask themselves today. And, for me, you've got to partition off your growth bets in a very, deliberate, specific manner, first in discovery so that they're paying attention to what's happening in the outside world.
Right.
When I think of our business, we sell trucks and we sell a lot of them in the center of this country. But if you look at what's happening from a demographic standpoint, people are moving to urban environments.
Right.
And depending on which study you look at, as much as 70% of the world's population in the next decade will be living in major urban areas. Well, that's a problem.
Right, that's different.
So you better pay attention to that. So one of the things we've done, and we use a lot of design thinking to sort of usher in these plays, and we think about design thinking a little bit differently than many other organizations. We use it to create connectivity. And what we do is we send out people in cross-functional teams, and we have them look at what's happening in an urban environment. And then they come back with all these new discoveries and insights. So that's really shifting the way that they think, taking them outside of the operational model, doing it cross-functionally so that you've got all the right resources in the room to be able to do something. And then we shift to, okay, now it's useless to have these great ideas. We call those discovery connections. It's useless to have new ideas. I don't know about you, but I usually have about 10 new ideas a day.
Yeah.
By the end of the day, I actually like one of them. And I'm not even sure I believe in it, and I'm not willing to share it with anybody yet. Maybe if I'm lucky at the end of the week, I have one good idea. You've got to put them into the world. Those discovery connections, and this is what the literature says that you can enhance insight discovery by 30% if you have these scouting teams. But that's useless unless you can get them pulled back in. That's when we say we need development connections. And a little bit like Amazon, you got to lock people into 2 pizza teams with very tight protocols as to when they've got to deliver, first an active prototype. And, it's really important for them to build something. So that's how we're thinking about it. We're thinking about it in a much more agile manner where you start with discovery. Once you've discovered something, then you've got to realign and reconfigure, I call these social arrangements, to now go do development. But that's not enough because what ultimately happens is you develop in a vacuum and it gets rejected by the rest of the organization. So you then have to go back to where we were a few moments ago, which is how can I now create a set of connections to diffuse this? And that's where you start to think about how do I get my idea to a friend and they can help me.
So that's interesting. If I hear you right, are you saying that, how am I saying this? Sometimes I get jumbled in my head with questions, which is good. It means you're making me think. But let me back up. Part of kind of what I found over my 25 years is that, you can have a brilliant idea, but until the rubber meets the road, which, perfect for General Motors, I suppose, you don't really know if an idea is worthy until you really build it, until, someone touches it and feels it. It doesn't have to be done, but you got to be able to get it off the PowerPoint, off the paper. Is that part of the process? Yes. And then are you saying that, but then the question becomes, right, how do you loop that back in? And also the second part of that, right, is how do you get organizational buy-in so that, as we had been talking about earlier, you actually get that momentum and that, check off on the ideas? Yeah.
And thinking about that latter question too early is oftentimes a problem for innovators. So let me go back to your question. So when you're in bimodal mode, one mode is about, pushing trucks out the back door and doing it as precisely and as efficiently with high quality as the highest levels of quality that you possibly can. That pays the bills. The second thing is to, start these growth bets, and be very disciplined about what your thresholds are and when you're going to decommission these things. That starts with discovery, but then the second phase of development, to your question, is we're not standing something up. We have very little investment. We're building to learn. We're building these prototypes and we're taking them out. We're testing them. We're testing them inside, and they get to different levels of resolution over time. And what we're trying to do is figure out, okay, we think this is what we've learned, but learning is an iterative process. And if we're agile, we're going to keep testing this and, tossing it out to a hand group of customers and run beta tests and figure out what part of this works. Okay, so what capabilities do we have that we can leverage? What don't we have? Who do we need to partner with? And you begin to think about, and these are very much partitioned off so that you have a lot of freedom, which is this adaptive space concept. And you at least in a part of the organization, you're acting like a startup.
I just want to pause for a second, Michael, because I think what you said about we're building to learn is so critical, because I think all too often we make the mistake of we're building to optimize to monetize, right? That's how we think of it. And I think we miss huge opportunities to really tweak and evolve and get our product or our service, whatever it is, right. If we don't have that mindset of what you just said, building to learn, which is a whole different place to even come from with the process, don't you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that happens the whole way through the process. When you're trying to diffuse, tension becomes really important, because now you've built to learn and you've got a small team who really believes in this thing, and they've went out and they've tested it and they think this is going to stand up in the world. But, it's got to stand up inside the organization first, and it's got to be an organization that can produce it. So that's where, the tension and some of the backlash that you actually get early on helps to create what I describe as greater fitness of the idea, so that it can in fact be scaled across other platforms. And it's a little bit like, this is my analogy. It may be a stupid analogy, but it's a little bit like an airplane taking off. It takes off into the wind because it gets greater liftoff faster, as opposed to taking off, with the wind, which is conventional wisdom. So what I want, once we actually believe in something and we have emotional conviction around it, what I then want, as we're thinking about this, is I want some tension. I want to pressure test it, and I want to go find, the challengers, as we describe them as, to make sure that they're refining it, making it better so that it can scale faster and get greater liftoff.
I think that's a great analogy. And I love what you said about needing tension. I think in innovation, there's often this myth that we should avoid tension, right? You go to the yes-anders and not the yes-butters. You go to the people who get it, not the people who don't. But all that tension actually, I think, builds way better innovation. I want to make sure we don't run out of time to talk about adaptive space. Also, because I had the privilege, thank you for sending it, of reading that first chapter of your upcoming book, also by the same name. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what's in it, why you wrote it, and just, one or two nuggets that readers are going to be excited to learn when they pick it up.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for asking. I think much of what we're describing and talking about here is a challenge that every organization faces, and it's this tension between, kind of the pressures to produce and deliver and the pressures to adapt and innovate.
Yeah.
And I haven't found, we've heard lots of people talk about how not to do it and why organizations are designed against it. And then sometimes we get people saying, well, you ought to just act like a startup. And for me, that's bad logic. For me, that's bad advice. This whole adaptive space concept is a little bit of where we just were. It's, if you think about those two tensions, the pressure to, adapt and then the pressure to actually produce, adaptive space sits squarely in between the two. It's a bridge. And it's where the innovators that we were talking about before have the freedom, the emotional, sort of relational capacity to be able to move through the organization. And maybe even sometimes it's actually physical space, although that's not what I mean by adaptive space. Right. So that people have this free trade zone, to test, to iterate, to, really build upon their idea. And it acts as a bridge to get these things scaled.
So talk a little bit about, I don't know if I know it's coming out in June. So the, is it tagline? Is that how you say it? Or the underline, how GM and other companies are positively disrupting themselves and transforming into agile organizations. Talk a little bit about that, because to your point, right, we talk so much about why it's not designed to do that. Bureaucracy, because you've got these big, $1 million ships that, God forbid, you make a mistake on them. You've got this, people who are managers. Then you ask them to be innovators. So what are one or two things from your book that are the opposite of that are the things that work?
Again, if I were to summarize it in very simple language, I would say, it's about setting intentional connections at different intervals in regards to when do we need to discover, when do we need to develop, and when do we need to go execute and scale. What that means is you can't do all three of those things at the same time. So I talked a little bit about being bimodal. The worst scenario, and this was the opposite end of the question, is that most organizations are what I call mixed mode. They're trying to do all three of those things at the same time. And when you look at that, and the network tells you a lot about this, when you look at that organization that's trying to discover, develop, and scale in the same breath, what you get is literally a mangled mess on the network. And what you get is confusion and chaos. And then you get frustration, and you get a lot of the things that we see inside of organizations. if you're thinking about it with this adaptive space concept, I always ask the question, what are you designing to do for today? And it may change as early as tomorrow. And today we're trying to discover. Well, tomorrow, now that we've discovered something interesting, we've got to develop it quickly. So I think that's where the word agile is so critical. Large, complex organizations can be as agile and as nimble as startups. They just have to be much more methodical about it because it's not natural to them. The more natural thing is to try to do everything or find a one-size-fits-all that stifles out, any ability to be agile.
You may have said this earlier, but I don't want to be assumptive. So I apologize if we kind of covered this, but in the discover, develop, and scale, is there one person that owns that whole process? Are they different leaders at different times? When I'm thinking about and visualizing this, brilliant organic network, how does that look with that process?
Yeah, and it works at the velocity across those cycles is very different depending on the scope of whatever it is that you're working on. There has to be some carryover from phase to phase, or you lose ownership.
Yeah.
Right? You don't just hand things over the wall. That's the other mistake. Lots of people think, lots of companies have thought about accelerators and incubators, and they take this stuff and detach it, and they try to get it started up and nurture it, and then they say, here, it's yours, implement it. Well, we all have emotional connectivity to the things that we're engaged in. And what ends up happening is, somebody says, yes, great business case. And then when times get tough, guess what's the first thing they kill?
I am so glad, by the way, just very quickly, that you mentioned that because I've seen it all the time. You'll see innovation groups, right? Incubators bubble up and then go away depending on the cycles of the marketplace. But the biggest challenge, I always call it the one-way tennis match because you lob that idea over the court and the person on the other side's like, duck and weave. I don't want anything to do with that. That's just more work on my plate because I have no ownership. Yeah. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
this will really sort of accentuate what I was just articulating. Another company, I can't mention the name, we went in and this was a very traditional centralized innovation function. They had an R&D organization and they had a bunch of design thinkers. I don't know how many PhDs, but there were probably 35 people and 25 PhDs. I mean, so this was a high caliber, very, 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 very smart team. For 3 years, they designed all these products. For 3 years, they built these concepts. Great market intelligence, doing all the things that we talk about with things like design thinking. And in 3 years, they had zero commercial successes and zero items in the pipeline.
No way.
So then, if you're a management team, you look at this and say, wow, that's a waste of our financial resources. So they did what anyone would do. They basically said, really smart people, we don't want to lose them. We're going to diffuse them out into the business, and we're going to give them really important jobs, but they're going to actually do something that's meaningful at this point. Something amazing happened. In the next year, 3 commercial successes, all 3 that originated in this central group. But now what happened was these people were at different influencing points throughout the organization, and this is adaptive space at its core. They literally got together in the evenings and would meet anywhere, coffee shops, break rooms, and they would continue to work on the same things that they were before, but now they're influencing at different points in the organization. And all of a sudden, boom, 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 these things started to, first of all, pop inside, and then ultimately got budget, marketing support, and everything else to be deployed outside.
So what a great story. And, I've seen that before where 5 years later, you're going, what's the result of all this work? Mm-hmm. But if I understand you right, and just to kind of loop this all together, this goes back to that social connectivity you've been talking about and those networks and how to really get the right people in the right place.
That's exactly right. We think of innovation as a technological phenomenon, and it is that. But it's equally inside of large, complex organizations a social phenomenon.
Yeah, that's great.
And you've got to think about those 2 things in order to be successful across time.
So before my last question, where can people go to connect with you and learn more?
So I am on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. But I have a website that's just been put up about the book as well. So adaptivespace, one word, .net, and you can find some information about the book.
Excellent. We will put links to all of that. And it's fantastic. I only got to read 1 chapter and I was riveted. So, and I think, let me just say for LaunchStreeters out there, we interview entrepreneurs as well on this show. The point is, how do you leverage innovation? How do you harness change? We want to find those people who are disrupting. And this is such a brilliant, and Michael's such a brilliant example of disrupting from within, that is possible and necessary all at the same time. So one last final piece of advice for LaunchStreeters out there trying to create that positive disruption you keep talking about.
I think we talked around this before, but if you really want to make a difference in the world and you're inside of a large organization, one of the things you've got to do is make this trade-off decision. Does it have to be mine? Am I willing to make the trade-off between ego and impact? If I have to hold on and cling on tightly to the thing that I invented and created, you likely are not going to get it launched inside of a complex organization. But if you're willing to let go of parts of it, the chances of you being able to stand that up and make a bold impact are much, much greater.
That is a great way to end the show. Ego versus impact. Michael, thank you so much for joining me. This has been absolutely insightful, and I can't wait for your book to come out. Maybe we can come back and talk a little bit more.
Fantastic. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
I know, right? So if you're like me, you're sitting there thinking, well, now I can't use the whole I'm in a large company, processes, bureaucracy, blah, 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 as an excuse to not be innovative. The truth is, structure and innovation can actually work hand in hand. I think the myth is that they're mutually exclusive. And in this interview with Michael, I think we learned the opposite. In fact, I think he showed us proof that the opposite is possible. So here's what I want you to do, LaunchStreeters. I want you to look at your work and I want you to think about where you have structure and processes. And then I want you to ask yourself, where are the gaps in that where I can innovate? It's going to sound like a tangent, but I swear it relates. One of my favorite YouTube videos that makes me laugh out loud is it was a Southwest Airlines attendant, and he did the flight, safety exits here, blah, blah, blah. The one that none of us listen to. Clearly, I don't listen to it. I can't even remember what they say. But he does it in a rap. In fact, if you type in Southwest David rap, you will find it. And the reason I love it is that's proof that innovation can exist within structure, within regulations. Because let's face it, the airline industry is one of the most regulated industries out there. But there's this little moment of innovation, of creativity. So I want you to do the same thing. Look at your work, look at the systems and processes, look at the structure, think of it as a good thing, and then ask yourself, where are the gaps? Where can I innovate within this? All right, can't wait to hear what you come up with. Tamara out.
Thanks for hanging out with us inside LaunchStreet. When you're ready to take your game to the next level, join the thousands of others that are upping their innovation edge on GoToLaunchStreet.com, the top online education resource and community platform for innovators looking to use innovation to get measurable results. Go to LaunchStreet.com.